Thank you, and thank you for inviting me and having me. It's been a very interesting conference. I enjoy hearing about different kinds of perspectives, especially from folks looking at things as very different from what I look at, robotics and engineering and modeling work, because I think it's very informative to the work we do trying to understand development in young children. I'm going to start today actually with some thank yous for collaborators on the research I'll be showing you today. Lynn Perry is my former graduate student. She's now at the University of Wisconsin. She actually helped collect data and did modeling work and theoretical work on both of the experiments I'm going to show you today. Linda Smith, as Gregor mentioned, my former mentor and now collaborator on a number of the projects. John Spencer, you'll see, collaborated on the first project I'm going to be talking about. And then Gregor Schoner, the first project also involves a dynamic neural field model and is with Gregor and John that I collaborate on that work. I have to also thank the parents and the children who make my research possible. I'm going to be talking about experiments with very young children, so I'm in debt to the parents who are willing to bring them into the laboratory for this. Also, the undergraduate members of my language and category development lab who collect a lot of the data, and then the funding sources, NICHD and NIMH. So what I want to, one more thank you, Erin Buss, the graduate student who helped me with the videos of the model running that I'll be showing you. Okay, so what I want to talk about today is one of the primary questions that motivates research in my lab, and that is the question of how children are so good at learning language, and specifically at learning words. So how is it that a child, like Katya, goes from having 1 or maybe 0 words in their productive vocabulary at 12 months of age to having as many as 680 words in that productive vocabulary by two and a half years later, okay? So by 30 months of age. And this is pretty amazing. In fact, it's been called amazing word learning because they do this in the context of very immature cognitive, perceptual, and motor systems, okay? So these are children, like I said, they're not even 3 yet in a lot of the studies we're doing. So these children can't even skip at this point, okay? There are a lot of abilities that still have to be developed. By some research, they're not actually able to effectively always bind small visual items in terms of the color and the shape together. So to give you a little bit of a sense for the way this is thought of, it's something usually like this. What you have is a mother and a baby looking at a very complex scene, such as this one in a preschool. In this scene, there are multiple things that could be referred to and talked about. So there are objects like the tables or the cups or the games or the trees. There are properties of those objects, such as blue and red and green. There are actions, such as playing with sand in the table or water in the table next to it. And there are all kinds of other things you might talk about. So there are lots of different possibilities for reference in this. What happens then is mom says a label, and the child's task is to look at this very complex scene and figure out what thing in the scene is being referred to. So find the beads in this scene. So it turns out that babies actually appear to be much better at this than we might expect, given that immature cognitive, visual, and perceptual system that I talked about. And the answer in the field has been to try to understand this by putting a lot of complex things in their head that help them to solve this problem, okay? Biases, constraints, Bayesian models, etc., that might help them get to the right referent. And as I'll talk about, not only get to the right referent, but then use that referent, that new word, productively. I'm going to argue today that we need to think about the child and parent in a different kind of way, and we need to think about it in terms of the themes of this conference, in terms of embodied communication. I think both parts of this title are important to think about in this context. We can think about communication because it makes us think about that back and forth reciprocal interaction between the parent and child unfolding over time. So baby points to something and mom gives the word instead of vice versa, okay? But I think we also want to think about embodiment because it highlights the fact that this learning is unfolding in time and in space. I think we're used to doing that, in my field at least, to the extent that we think about the child structuring the word learning situation, okay? So it's typical to talk about the child maybe moving through this scene and pointing to different things and thereby eliciting different names or property names and actions from mom over time, okay? So the child might then structure the information that's provided to them, and that, of course, will change what's learned in a situation like that. Okay? But I also want to think about how the child's cognitive system is structuring this learning interaction. Okay? And by that, I mean I want to think about how the child's exploratory, attentional, and memory systems and the body with which those systems act influence the learning situation she is in. So I'm going to argue today that thinking about embodied communication, what it does for us is help to understand how this child's body and past behavior with that body helps to bring what he or she knows, their cognition, to bear in the current word learning context. And to do this, I'm going to show you two studies that demonstrate this point. The first will show how embodied communication works over a very short time scale to reduce the ambiguity in this reference situation. So exactly this kind of situation, exactly this kind of context where there are many things that could be named and you have to reduce the number of possibilities down to the one that is applicable at this moment. Okay? I'll also show you a set of data from a second study that moves on to the other problem that children face. Not just finding the referent, but then to know that word, you have to use it productively in a new situation. So you need to generalize that word, bead, now to this new instance. And I'm going to show you how embodied cognition actually also supports children's generalization in a fairly hard context as well. Okay, so an overview of my talk. I'm going to show how social aspects of communication are embodied in shared space and time, and how this helps children's ability to resolve ambiguous reference. I'm also going to show critical role for embodied context and active exploration in toddlers' generalizations of names for non-solid substances. And that will be the second part of the talk. Okay, so for this first bit, what I'm going to argue is we need to think about taking the child, sorry. What we're going to start with is this context of finding the referent in this very complex situation. And I'm going to do it in terms of a much simpler situation in the laboratory and a classic study by Dare Baldwin back in 1993. So what Dare Baldwin was interested in is the question of how you might be able to use simple associative properties to link a name to an object. Okay? And specifically how you might do that given that often you don't have the name and the object co-occurring in time. So the way she studied this was a pretty simple task. Two novel objects that the child didn't have words for. These children are 18 months of age. Okay? So they have a couple words. They're kind of early in the vocabulary development process. What happens is she gives the children one object to play with and takes it away. Gives the child another object to play with, takes it away. And then at some point she's going to take both of those objects and put them in opaque buckets so the child cannot see them. Okay? Then in full view of the child, she's going to look into one of those buckets and say, Modi, Modi, I see a Modi. There's a Modi in here. Okay? Next, she's going to reach into the other bucket, not the one she looked at, and pull out the object on the other side. Okay? So she labeled that bucket. Now she's going to pull out the spring from the other bucket. So she's separated the naming event from perception of the object, and the next object you see is actually not the one you're supposed to bind the name to. Okay? Then she'll show you the one that was in the bucket that was labeled, and then she'll do a forced choice task, present both objects together, and say, where's the Modi? Okay? Fairly challenging task. 18-month-olds, however, are very good at this. They will select the one that was in the bucket that Baldwin was looking at when she said the word 67% of the time, so greater than chance levels. Okay? Baldwin's explanation for this ability was something like this, thinking that the child was reasoning along these lines. Okay? The speaker intends to label the object in the bucket on the left. Object A is in the bucket on the left. Object B is in the bucket on the right. Therefore, A is the Modi. Okay? So it would be this kind of inferential process, kind of stepping through what is known to figure out what is being referred to. Okay? I looked at this study along with my collaborators and thought there's something else going on. Okay? And at this point, I think I'll demonstrate it to you just to give you kind of that sense. So I'm going to be tricky and move over here. And I don't have buckets, so bear with me. But it goes something like this. Okay? Greg can be my child. Okay, so see this? Look at this. Play with that. All right, now look. See this? Look at this. You can play with that. All right, have fun. Okay. And then we'll do that a few more times. Okay? And then we'll put the objects in buckets so you can't really see it. And I'll go, oh, Modi. There's a Modi in here. There's a Modi in here. Okay? And then I'll show you this object. Right? Take that away. Whoops, and I did that wrong. Show you this object. Take that away. Show you that object. Take it away. And then give you both and ask for the Modi. Okay? Now, from the child's point of view, if I'm actually the child, when each of these objects is presented, okay, and I'm going to flip it so that I'm like you with the child. When that object is presented, what I have to do is I have to turn my body towards this. I'm a child, so my arms are more like this, okay, and reach for this object, okay, and grab it, okay. Then I might play with it for a while, and then I'll give it back, okay. When this object is presented, same thing. It's going to be slid a little closer to me, but I'm going to orient towards it. I'm going to reach for it, and I'm going to grab it, okay. So my attention is going to go to one or the other side of the table, right? My body is going to go to that side of the table as I reach for it and I grab it, right? And then I'm going to play with it and have experience with it, okay? We thought that that actually might be central. And the fact that Baldwin very nicely kept everything consistent in spatial location as the child was familiarized with the objects. So by our view, this is not really about an inferential process, understanding what's in the other person's head and what they're trying to intend you to look at. Rather, we think this is unfolding in time and in space. So our proposal is this is about objects in space and time. And to test that, I'm going to do a series of studies kind of try to convince you that that's actually what's going on. The first one starts with this issue. If the key to a children's success is in the association between an object and its recent location in space, then children should fail to map the name to the object if that association is weakened. All right? So what we did was a study where we first replicated Baldwin's task. This is the no-switch condition. So here, we're going to present one object on one side of the table, and then the other object on the other side, back and forth. Then we'll present the two buckets. We'll look into one and we'll say Modi. And then we'll represent one of those objects, and then the second, and then we will do our test event, get the Modi, just like Baldwin did. In the second case, what we're going to do is fail to keep the spatial locations consistent. So present the binoculars on the left side, then the spring on the right, then the binoculars on the right, and the spring on the left. Look into one bucket and label it. Pull out the spring from the other bucket. Then represent the binoculars. Go to the center location and say, get the Modi. Okay? Now, I've just mentioned this now. We have to do this in all the studies. I'm not going to talk about it. In between these tests, we do this with multiple objects. Oh, there's the key trials in case you didn't catch it. In between these trials, we include filler trials with familiar objects to make sure the children understand the task. Remember, these are 18-month-olds, so they're fairly young. And so we do things where we present them things we know they already know the word for by parent report and ask them to retrieve those objects. In those trials, it helps maintain the child's interest, but it also makes sure that they're responding to us, answering the question we want them to answer. And they're always above 80% on those trials in all the conditions, even though I'm not going to talk about them anymore. Okay, so the critical thing is at this moment where the referential cues at the naming event are strong, and across the two experiments, they're identical. So if it's about referential intent and understanding somebody else's referential intent, then the children should map in both conditions. Okay? But if space matters, they should fail to map in the no-switch condition. Okay? So in this experiment, then, we run 24 children between 17 and 18 months of age. Half are in the switch, half in the no-switch. There are 8 test trials with 2 different sets. They're counterbalanced, the target, the side, the names, all those things. The results are that in the no-switch condition, children were very good, 73%, close to Baldwin's 67%. But in the switch condition where we messed with the consistency of space, children are at fault to chance levels. They're not able to make the mapping anymore. So children only map the name of the object in the bucket when space was held constant. So that made us wonder if the bucket even matters. Okay? Remember, from Baldwin's perspective, this is about whether you have the name and the object together in time to make the mapping. Okay? So you need that bucket to map it. But maybe you don't need the bucket at all. So what we're going to do is the exact same study, but now we're going to point to an empty tabletop and present the label. Okay? Fairly odd. Okay? It's a little bit of a weird thing to do. I'll give you a sense for it. So you're going to familiarize with that one, and then you're going to get to play with that one. Okay? Do that a couple more times, and then I'm going to go, Modi, Modi, Modi. Okay? Then I'm going to show you this one again, and then I'll show you that one again. Okay? And then I'll put them both in the middle and have you get one. Get Modi. Okay? A little bit weird, pointing at nothing and labeling. Okay? Children are very good at rolling with this kind of thing, however. So, again, we're pointing to an empty tabletop, providing the label for them. Same kind of design, 16 children between 17 and 19 months, 4 test trials. The sides that were labeled, everything was kind of counterbalanced across the children. The results were that 72% of the children still chose the spatially linked object compared to 67% in Baldwin. Okay? So even in this kind of strange naming event, they are able to bind the novel word to the novel object with very good accuracy. So I think what experiments 1 and 2 tell us about is that this is about, not about hidden objects, rather, but instead it may be about how locations activate memories for objects just previously experienced at those locations. It turns out that we encode information about location in a lot of the stuff that we are remembering all the time. And the example I like to give of this, if you think about reading a novel, and maybe it's a complex novel and there are a lot of characters introduced, you read about some character, and then a few chapters later you're trying to remember who that person was or where they were from. You can't remember exactly the bit of information you need, but you can remember, oh, he was introduced at the top of the left page at some point. Okay? We tend to have that kind of stuff encoded. And that might be the basis of what's going on here. So we're going to examine these cognitive processes in a model that combines objects, locations, and words. So this is our dynamic neural field model, very simple model in this case. We've got 4 fields that are composed of label dimension and feature dimension, such as shape and color, or a space dimension. Okay? The way this works is, and there are a lot of people familiar with dynamic neural fields here, and some who work with them in much more complex ways than I do, but just a basic rundown. You can think of it as a set of individual neurons all connected here. They're interacting by a local excitation, lateral inhibition function, so they can form peaks that help them remember where things are. This model does have, I'll get to that in a second. So in this particular case, what we're looking at is maybe spring shape and color here, and binocular shape and color here. These things are bound so that they're sharing, the fields are sharing information across the spatial dimension here. They're also sharing information across the fields this way, so that, as we'll see when the movies play, that information about this object in this space feeds down into the labeled dimension as well. This model also has Hebbian learning, so that we can represent the fact that children are coming into the studies at 18 months with somewhere between, well, it can be quite variable, but somewhere between 15 to 100 words in their productive vocabulary. Okay? So this represents down in the label dimension here, the label fields, that these children already know some words that they might be bringing with them. Maybe they already know, cup, and so here's cup shape and cup material, okay? Or cup color, Okay, so the way the model works in terms of the specific task is we model all the different steps in the task. So here we're going to present the binoculars in the spatial location, and we'll see that it builds peaks of activation for the shape and the color, and then those also feed down into these fields where it leaves a little trace, even though we're not presenting a label just yet. So let me see if I can get this to play. So there's our binocular and the ridge of active. Whoops, excuse me. I think it bumped right on. Do that again. Our binoculars and the ridge of activation that it's sending down into the coupled fields, representing that shape and that color. Of course, there's no label presented, so there's no specific point of activation along this dimension. So we give it that activity, and then we do the next step and present the other object. So now we have spring, shape, and color. Just gets a little familiarization with that. I'm going to skip the next two trials are identical, and we'll go down to this pointing event. So now what we're going to see is a location in space is cued with a point. And so that's going to come in terms of a ridge of activation, but there's not going to be a specific shape or color because there's nothing on the table at that point. And we're going to say a specific word, so there'll be a ridge of activation corresponding to that particular word, but it's just the word. There's no object there, so it's not a particular shape or color. Quickly see what happens there, though. Okay, so as you can see, what's happened is the activation of that word presented at that location combined with that spatial location reminded the model of what had been there before. Okay? Then we go on and we do the test event. So now what we're going to do is present the two objects, but not in the spatial locations they were presented before, now instead at the center of the table. And it's going to have to select one of the two. So you'll see it's pretty quick, but it sends a ridge of activation into the label fields. We're saying the word Modi, they intersect, and then it will select one of those. I'll play that again. Okay, so you can see that it started to kind of choose between the things that it's seen before in its memories. And then at some point, it selects one of those two, and then that sends activation back up, so it selects the object actually in space. Okay. Okay, so we modeled all 8 steps of both of the first 2 experiments, so both of those 2 versions. We run 100 simulations per task, so we can check that it's not based on the specific initial conditions that the model starts with. We run 4 versions to verify convergence. And there are no changes to the parameters in this model for these experiments or for any of the others that I'm going to show you in a little bit. So we can set it up, and then we can simulate all these different conditions without having to do local tweaks. So these are the results, just to remind you from before. In that first experiment, no switch when space is held constant. Children are very good. They're also very good when space is held constant, even if there's nothing on the table at the point the label is given. But when space is not held constant, they're at chance levels. And the model shows the same kind of pattern. In the no switch condition, it binds and selects the object that was in the consistent spatial location 67% of the time. In the switch condition, it falls to chance levels. Whoops, excuse me. And in the case without a cue at the bucket location, it's still very, very good. Okay? Now, I already kind of pointed it out, but what's going on here is during that pointing event, it's cueing the memory of the object that was previously experienced at that particular location. So there is a memory that's actually active at the point when the label is provided. It's not the object itself, but there is something cognitively there. Okay, and just to remind you, it's going to do it again. So when the label comes in and the point, it reactivates that memory for the thing that had been at that location, and it's able to bind. Okay? So if it's basically about cueing the spatial location where something had been experienced before, especially in this very simple task with only 2 locations, it may be enough just to cue the side without the specific location of the object, okay? And again, if we're thinking about young children who are interacting with these objects and turning their bodies towards those objects, reaching for those objects in space, it may not be that we have to cue a specific location. We can just cue one of the 2 sides. So in this next experiment, what we're going to do is instead of pointing to the location on the table, we're going to just snap our fingers to get the child to orient in one of the 2 directions and then say the label. Okay? So we have 3 children. Experiment 3, we have 16 children between 17 to 19 months, half in the snap to the left, half in the snap to the right. We have 4 test trials. The child results, 68% still chose the spatially linked object, even with this more diffuse cue. Okay? So cueing the general side in which they had experienced this particular object in this dichotomous case was enough to help them bind the name to the object. Model actually is also able to do this task now with a more diffuse and less strong cue at the pointing event. So the ridge we send in when we point in this case is not as spatially located, it's more diffuse, and it's not as strong. Okay, so if consistency in space matters, we want to know next, like, how strong is space? So what we want to ask is, can consistent spatial location, or can the consistent association of an object and a spatial location override other bases for association? So what we're going to do here is look at space as opposed to what's called ostensive naming. Okay? I've been presenting the context where the child has to do some work to figure out what the referent of the word is, but that's not always what we do. Sometimes what we do is we hold up a object and name it directly. Pointer! See the pointer? Here's the pointer. Okay? In such a case, when I have only one object that's in joint attention, both are in view, and I label it, a child as young as 13 months is able to demonstrate retention in that case of that newly learned word. Okay? So that's pretty strong. The question is, can space override that? So we're going to do the ostensive naming condition. We're going to call it our control. So basically, we're going to hold up the spring, and we're going to say Modi. In the other case, what we're going to do is have the same naming event, okay, but we're going to precede it with having associated the binoculars with that spatial location. So give them some memory of what was in that spatial location, but then at the critical naming point, swap the other object in. Okay. So now we're going to pit space versus time. If you have those 2 things together in time, is it stronger than space? This kind of also returns back to some of Baldwin's original issues. So 16 children between 17 and 19 months. The side labeled and the target object both counterbalanced. What we find is in that control condition, as I said, children are pretty good at this. 76% of the time, they picked the object that was ostensively named. Okay? But in that competition condition where we had set up another object having been in that spatial location, it drops to 40%. Okay? And that means that space is winning 60% of the time. So space is arguably a stronger cue for naming than the co-occurrence in time. The model actually can also capture these results. So in the control condition, it does very well. And in the competition condition, it falls to chance. And just to show you, here are the results of the simulations across all the studies I've shown you so far. The children are the black bars, the model, the white bars. And as you can see, the model is able to capture these changes in performance across the different experimental conditions. Okay, so space is special, okay? And children can clearly use space to bind a name to an object in the context of this task, okay? The model's able to capture children's performance in this task, but we know that the model uses space to bind names to objects because space cues the previously associated object. We can see it working as it unfolds in the model. So space is special to the model. We put the spatial dimension in there. Okay? Question is space equally special to children? That is, will another kind of contingent cue work? Okay, would another associate work? So what we did in this case is now swap out space for colored trays. So now we're going to do everything in the central location of the experiment, right at midline for the child, but we're going to put our objects either on a blue tray or a red tray, okay? And we'll keep that consistent. And then during the naming event, I'm going to pull out one of those trays, in this case the blue one, point to it and say, Modi, 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 okay? Then I'll represent this other object on its colored tray, and then represent the labeled tray with its object. Then I'll go back and have the exact same test event I've had in all the previous cases. Okay? I'll also say, actually, I'll wait on the next slide. Okay? Same kind of idea, 16 children with everything kind of counterbalanced. Again, there's only 2 test trials in this case because they found this a little weirder. Memory trials, just to make sure that they knew the binding, the relationship between the object and the color. After we do the test event, we put both of the colored trays back on the table with the objects and ask them to put the objects on the right colored trays. So do they remember what was on blue and what was on red? And as you can see, they're very good at that, greater than 70% for all the children. But in the study, when we ask to pick the color-linked object, they fall to chance. They're not using color to bind the name to the object. Model, now using color dimension as well, doesn't use color to bind. Kind of knew that in the model because we haven't set up color to be a binding dimension. Okay, so now across all simulations, we see a case now where consistency isn't helping children, and it also doesn't help the model. So, the child data and the simulations of these experiments demonstrate children's behavior in this task is not about hidden objects or complex inference processes. It's about associations between objects and locations. So making those associations weaker disrupts that linking of a name to a novel object. Prior association of an object in a location is also going to disrupt the linking via temporal congruence, which is otherwise quite strong. And space is then special in facilitating binding. So what we want to ask next is how far does this extend? Are the spatially grounded processes seen in these experiments and model reflected in everyday social learning contexts? Okay? So in that scene that I showed you at the beginning, there were multiple objects. Those objects could be moved around, especially during the day in a preschool. They're going to not end up in the location they started. But it's possible that spatial consistency could still help. Now, we didn't go all the way to the level of the preschool, but we had some idea that this might work. So my son Alec used to use space to refer. Here he is at mealtime. And what you can see, he's got cucumbers and tomatoes on his plate. He also has bananas, which were the preferred food out of those 3. So he quickly eats all the bananas up. And when he wanted more, he pointed to the spatial location to ask before he could say those words. Okay? So he was using space to refer in this context. We want to know, does it extend out into more real-world situations? So what we did was bring parents and children into the laboratory and ask the parents to teach their children names for novel objects. Okay? We told them nothing about the experimental hypothesis. We just told them, here are some objects. This one is a Modi and this one is a Blicket. Please teach your child those names, and then we're going to test them later on the learning. We did have the same experimenter test all the children so there wouldn't be biases introduced by the parents at that point. So our question is, do parents naturally spatially segregate the objects, and does it matter for learning? So this is a slice of just 15 seconds in one of the videos. We videotaped the parents and the children from a couple different angles, and then we code all the behaviors over the course of the experiment. So what we have here, it's a little small, I know, but it's coding the left hand, the left table, the right hand, and the right table. The white bars refer to the binoculars. The black bars refer to the springs. And these little hash marks are when the mom actually said the name. Okay? So what you can see is we start with the objects both on one side of the table. And this mom spatially segregates. Okay? She leaves the binoculars sitting there, but she picks up the spring, holds it for a minute, in her right hand and then shifts it to the left side of the table, right? And then she picks up the binoculars on the other side, and she keeps the binoculars on one side and the spring on the other side. Give you a little sense for what this looks like. Okay, so here she is with those two objects on two sides of the table. Now she's picking one up and referring to it. And there she is with, she's holding the spring on one side, and the child's holding the other one. Okay? So this mom did spatially segregate those objects. Okay? Not all parents did that, so here's the data from another parent, a similar string. And as you can see here, this parent, they start in the same place. She keeps both objects on the right side of the table, and later switches them both to the left side. Okay, and that looks something like this. Okay. So what we found across all the parents was a range in how much they kept the objects spatially separated and how much they manipulated them. We coded a number of different behaviors. I'll tell you just about a few of them. So the two hands behavior, so how often they kept the objects in two separate hands, ranged from 32% to 100%. So some moms just kept them all like this the whole time. Okay? How consistent they were in that proportion. So once they kind of initially set up one object on one side and the other object on the other side, how consistent did they keep that? That ranged from half the time to almost all the time. And this correlated with the child's learning. Okay, so here we have the percent of time parent kept objects in consistent spatial locations and the child's correct responses out of the 6 trials with the experimenter. And what you can see is a very nice correlation. Children whose parents kept things in consistent spatial locations learned the words better. Now, interestingly, learning was not correlated with the specific age of the children. The children ranged a little bit in this particular study. The number of times mom named the object, or the total time they spent holding. Also very interesting, I think, is the fact it was not related to the child's holding patterns. And in fact, children were not consistent in their handling. Kind of thought mom would set something up and baby would maybe follow, and that would be the way it would work. It wasn't the case in this case. It was how mom held things that mattered. Okay. So in terms of embodied communication, what I'm arguing is that words occur in time and that the reference occur in time and space. And the space can help to organize where you look and what is selected, and that we're encoding that spatial information in memory as we're doing these tasks. And that can help then cueing that space later can help to activate those memories. And this enables the binding of words to objects and allows things in the just previous past to be bound to those in the present. It allows the child to bring what they had experienced to bear at that moment in naming, even if the object is not present. Okay? Now, in this way, then, I think the embodiment of social interactions may serve as a binding agent for word learning. Okay? These are very young children. They are definitely socially engaged, but it may be that it's that shared space and time, and as this communication event is unfolding, that's really critical for the understanding of the social interaction. So understanding these interactions, I think, will help ground, or understanding the use of space in these interactions will help ground our understanding of children's use of social cues to word meaning. Now, of course, what I've shown you today is in a laboratory kind of situation, kind of removed from that very complex scene that I started you with. That's so we can kind of control everything. So it's a pretty simple interaction here. Even this one, where it's natural in terms of mom's behaviors, is simple in terms of the number of things there. It's not exactly this complex setting that we're talking about, but there is a lot of recent research, and some of this is, a lot of it is actually Linda Smith's work, that does show differences in how this situation might be configured, that it may not be this setting where you've got a complex scene with baby and child outside of that scene watching what's going on, but of course the case that the child is actually influencing these interactions. So I'll just start. These are a couple videos from head cam studies. Now what they're actually doing is putting little cameras on the baby's forehead and recording the input the child gets over the course of the day at home. Okay? This top one is in a simple laboratory setting with multiple interactors. I'll get that started. And there are a lot of interesting things to note. One, of course, is that complex scene may actually not be quite as complex as we originally envisioned it. Children's short arms matter, right? And it means that sometimes there's only one possible referent in view. Okay? There are properties of that object still, but it's not the case that it's this huge, buzzing, blooming confusion we might have predicted. Here's a slightly different case, the child structuring their own input at mealtime. Of course, this is a little bit removed from the eyes. It's not eye tracking. It's a little bit above. But it still gives a very good sense of the kind of input the children are getting, the regularities in that input, and the way their cognitive system is structuring that input. And how interesting feet are. Anybody who has children knows that they find their feet very interesting, maybe because they can get to them. Okay, the second video actually also bridges a little bit into my next topic. So I've talked a bit about how shared space can help children relieve some of the ambiguity in these naming situations. What I want to talk about now is that kind of next step and a crucial role for embodied context and active exploration in the toddler's generalization of novel names. So how children are generalizing names for non-solid substances. You have to bear with me a little bit. This is a little bit of a complicated literature. I'm going to try to step you through some of the issues before we get to the main study. And of course, you should stop me at any point if things aren't clear. Give you a sense of what was going on. These two cups, one of these two cups is milk, and the other one is glue. Okay? Who thinks we should pick up and drink the cup on your left? Show of hands. Who thinks we should drink the cup on the left? Okay, so that would be the milk on the left. Okay? Who thinks the milk's on the right? Oh, and most of you are just sitting there. Nobody wants to drink any of the milk. Okay, from this static visual image, it's pretty darn hard to tell, right? Now, of course, if I put my movie in motion, what we're going to see is if you stick your hands in there, you'll quickly figure out that that's the milk, and you could have drank that, but you would not want to drink that. Okay? And of course, there's probably some other cues that would have helped you, okay? But the visual information in terms of touching and exploring is critical to telling these non-solids apart, okay? Milk and glue are things that babies experience early, right? Now, moms may help control that situation. Interestingly, though, there's research that suggests that babies don't actually need to touch those two stimuli to tell those two things apart, okay? So 5-month-old infants distinguish non-solid things from solid things via visual cues alone. And slightly younger and older infants, 3, 7, and 10-month-olds, can actually discriminate small quantities of sand. Okay. Now, it's not actually visual cues alone in these cases. These are, of course, with these very young babies, habituation studies, and we always like to talk about how much they know based on these habituation studies. We have to remember all the information we're providing in these studies. And, of course, these are dynamic events that unfold in time that they're watching, and they get a lot of information from that. So it's not the static glue milk picture I gave you. It's the video playing that they're distinguishing. Okay, but it's not a simple task. Now, to kind of get you into where we're going with this in terms of generalization, I want to tell you about the task that we use with children to test generalization. This is a novel noun generalization task. And what this has revealed is that toddlers' knowledge of this ontological distinction between solids and non-solids appears to get disrupted when you start labeling them. And this is how we know that. So what we do in a lot of my studies, and those of other folks as well, is we present the child with a novel object that we've created so we know that they can't know what it is at all. And then we test them with two objects that vary the properties of the first one in systematic ways. So this one's the same shape but a different color and material, and this one's the same material but a different shape. Okay? And what we'll do is say, this is my zup, which is your zup? And they have to pick. Okay? And what we find is that from about 24 months of age on, children will pick the one that matches in shape. This is the shape bias. In terms of non-solids, we can do a very similar thing. And now we can present some non-solid groups. So this is actually a hair gel, okay, in a particular shape. We can show them the same shape but different stuff, or the same stuff in a different shape, and say, this is my zup, which is your zup. What we find in this case, however, is that the results are not as conclusive, okay? It's not clear that children are actually able to correctly get the non-solid stuff in this case and pick this one as the ZUP. And the reason this is inconclusive is it's pretty complicated. There are a number of different factors. These are just some representative data to show you that over the course of vocabulary development, so we're dividing children here by the number of words in their productive vocabulary, what we see is the emergence of this shape bias. So this is the mean number of shape choices in that forced choice task. Above chance mean you're going with the one that matches in shape. And what we see is with GEL, up into the point where they have 250 nouns in their vocabulary, they have many more words, they're still at chance. They're not able to pick one of those two objects. Okay? Now, it turns out there are a lot of things that matter in these tasks. Another reason why we always have to be careful when we say what children know from these things, it turns out many factors in the task will matter. So when we do these studies, so I'm going to say this is my ZUP, which is your ZUP. Okay? I can vary properties of the stimuli. It's not showing up perfectly well, but in the version I showed you, what we had was an exemplar and then one that matched in shape and one that matched in material only. Other studies have sometimes used objects that match in material and color. Okay, so this matches actually in two features. We also, before we do any of those trials, we have to do some training trials just to warm the child up and let them know what the game is. So what we'll do is we'll present them with an object they know. Look, here's my duck. Okay? And then we'll present them with two things. In my studies, what I typically do is give another object that's completely identical, so I'm not biasing them towards one of the dimensions I'm interested in, and something that's completely different. So this is my duck, get your duck. Okay? But you could do that with solid objects, or you could do that with non-solid substance. So this is blue Play-Doh and peanut butter. And when you're doing it with pieces, you might also, or with non-solid, you might also sometimes break those into pieces, because that's important information about it being non-solid. Okay? It turns out that all those things matter. So here's a study looking at, again, proportion shape choices in a two-object forced choice. Now we systematically vary between conditions and children what information we gave them before they did the task. Okay? So here we did training with solids only, so that's the ducky. We only presented them with whole exemplars, and our material matching object only matched in material. And what we get is a shape bias, but not a material bias. Okay? And these are 24-month-olds. If we switch it, so now we have solids only in training, but sometimes we show exemplars in pieces and still only have material matching test objects. We still get the same kind of pattern. But as soon as we put solids and non-solids in training, the shape bias goes away. And it's only when we now add material test objects that match in material and color that we see they attend to material. They need multiple cues to show a bias to generalize names for non-solids by material. Okay, now of course in English there's another bunch of information that might be useful, and that is the count-mass distinction. This of course varies cross-linguistically, but basically in English, when I'm going to label something, I usually have to provide the number of things that can be individuated or counted. So these would be count nouns. So we say 1 table, 2 tables, 3 keys, 4 keys, 3 cars, right? Whereas when we're talking about a substance, we're going to talk about the amount of that substance, and we're going to quantify it in some way. So these would be the mass nouns. So I'll say a table, 3 chairs, some milk. And if I say a water, you're probably going to think about this, right? A typically construed size of water or amount of water. That also means that for children, if I give them syntactic information, that might help them know how to generalize novel words. So I could say a wug, and that might suggest I'm talking about a solid, individuatable thing. Or if I say some wug, I should be talking about a non-solid mass. Okay? So in this kind of case, if I say this is a ZUP, which is a ZUP, you should go with that object. And if I say this is some ZUP, now maybe that's going to help you get to that material matching object, because you now want to get some of the same stuff. It turns out, however, that count-mass syntax is not perfect in English, and it doesn't actually help with the generalization for non-solids in both directions. So if I give a child a solid object and say so I say a wug, they'll attend to shape. If I give them a solid object and attend to shape, and say some, so some wug, they're still going to attend to shape. If I give them a non-solid substance and say some, and I also, as I showed you, make it match in pieces and color, then they'll attend to material. But if I give them a non-solid substance and a count noun, they go back to attending to shape. Okay? This starts to be part of what I was telling you about in terms of naming these objects messes up that early ontological distinction between solids and non-solids. Okay? They don't seem to know how solids and non-solids work when we get to naming them. And there's two possible reasons for this. One is that the early noun vocabulary in English is not actually balanced in terms of the information that they get. So this represents the space, and the square represents the 312 nouns typically found in the early productive vocabulary of a 30-month-old. Okay? The space inside the circles represents the number of those that are count nouns, names for solid objects by adult judgments, or names for categories well organized by similarity and shape. And of course, the overlap then here in the middle would be the number of count nouns that are names for solid objects in categories well organized by similarity and shape. This is cup and key and car and bottle, etc. Okay? This space on the outside is what's left over for all your non-solids. Okay? And that's what that looks like. Okay? So among those 312 nouns, if I swap out those circles for these, we have some mass nouns. We have some names for categories well organized by similarity and material. So this is milk in here. This would also be milk in here. In fact, milk would be right in here. Actually, milk's right in there. And it's a non-solid as well. Okay? There's some categories that are material-based, like pretzel, that's material-based, but it's not non-solid. Okay? And what you can see here is that in the early noun vocabulary, children have a lot more information about this side than this side. And this is a lot more regular than this is. Okay? If I give you a non-solid, half the time it's not a material-based category. Okay? That could be one of the things that makes generalizing names for non-solids difficult. There's another reason that it might be kind of difficult, though. And that's because if we just focus in on those non-solids, it turns out this is a very small set. This is 14 words. Here they are. And you should notice a regularity. They're foods. The words for non-solids that children learn early are names for foods. And this is interesting, of course, because children experience foods, and therefore the non-solids they know how to name, in a very particular context, the high chair. And that's important because children get to do something in the high chair they don't get to do a lot of other places. They get messy. Okay? So we wondered, is it the case that what children know about jelly and pudding might actually be embodied in an important way? Okay? It might have to do with the touch and exploring and feeling these things, much like you had to do with the milk and the glue, to know what's the same stuff. Does the high chair context then bring out children's knowledge of non-solids? Okay? So on that longer time scale, their developmental history of messing with things in a high chair, does it help them with this ontological distinction? Okay? So what we did is we brought in 72 16-month-olds. Actually, there were more than that, but those are the ones that got through the task. Half were at our typical laboratory table, which isn't so different from the table over there. Half were seated in a high chair. Half we did in a naming condition, and half in a no-name condition. Okay? The picture's a little dark. I'm sorry about that. But these are the exemplars, or sorry, the test stimuli. So this would be the exemplar. This is the one that I'm going to say, this is my wug. And then this one is the same stuff in a different shape. And this is, same stuff in a different shape, and this is the same shape but different stuff. Okay? Because we're in a high chair and they're used to eating, this time we're going to use all foods. Okay? So this is actually Latina. And I think that is a kind of jelly, right? Sometimes we're going to present the exemplar in pieces because that's important for non-solids. The naming versus no naming condition. So sometimes we're going to say, this is my wug, get your wug. In other cases, we're going to say, this is mine, get yours. We use that as a kind of control to make sure they think all the stimuli are about equally interesting, okay? Or to see what they would think if they weren't naming. We also asked parents about the eating habits of their child. People vary in how messy they let their children be in the high chair, it turns out. And we quoted exploratory behaviors. So at the beginning of all these trials, children tend to have a novelty bias. So when we're presenting these objects, we'll first present them all three just like this and let them explore the stimuli for a few minutes. Then we'll take them back. We'll hold up the exemplar and name it or not, and then we'll give them the other objects to select between. Okay? And we're going to code the way they explore those stimuli in that minute before the trial starts. Is that all? Okay. Okay, so these are the data. They're coded in terms of attention to shape because that's what's more common in the literature. And of course, we've got multiple factors here. So we have the table condition, the high chair condition. We have naming and no naming, and then we have those trials when the exemplar was presented whole versus it was pieces. Very complicated here. What we really have here is, whoops, oh my goodness, sorry, very excited clicker, is a three-way interaction, okay? So we used modeling techniques to reveal that we needed seating, naming, and trial type to explain this full interaction. And they're all completely necessary. So models, regression models that remove any of those don't capture the pattern of data as fully. As you can see, though, it's mostly driven by this condition where they have pieces and they're naming it, okay, in the high chair. That's when they're most likely to go with non-solids. So we're going to examine that a little bit more, okay? So this is attention to material in the context of either the no naming condition or the naming condition for children in the high chair or at the table. And this is specifically those pieces trials, okay? And what you can see is in the no naming condition, we have children showing a material bias at the table, fairly high, okay? Some children at chance, these are a number of individual children, and there are a few children showing a shape bias. But when we go to names, we see this difference between the high chair and the table. So in the naming condition, children seated at the high chair are attending to material, but those seated at the table are either at chance or a few of them are showing a shape bias. So children in the high chair attend to material more on those pieces trials. Now, as I said, we coded those actions. This is what we're talking about, so grasping those objects, picking up a little bit, or bringing to mouth. Those tend to be the actions in which children are really engaging with stimuli, and so those are the messy actions. There were some non-messy actions. Some children are more reserved, so they might lightly poke it, but don't really get their hands in there and mess with it, okay? Or they might do kind of a light tap with the finger. We also looked at other kinds of behaviors, so examining the objects, throwing them. Yes, they throw our stimuli at us sometimes. Grouping them, touching them with each other, etc. And we also looked at social actions, so positive affect, negative affect, requesting that the experimenter wipe the stuff off their hands, and things like that. So in terms of manual exploration, we used mixed linear regression models. They showed that parents who reported parents reported that children who sat in the high chair at home were messier. So in general, if your child's in a high chair, they're messier. Could go either reason. Could be they're in the high chair because they're messy, or they're messy because they're in the high chair. We don't know. The high chair context, however, supports this manual exploration in the sense that children in the high chair in the lab were messier with our stimuli. Okay? This was especially true of those in the naming condition. And it's important to note that we looked at some of those other behaviors. There were no differences in terms of the social behaviors, experimenter prompts, any of those things. Okay? So in the high chair, we're treating the children the same as those in the, at the table, but those children are acting differently with our stimuli. And furthermore, children in the high chair were messier with the material matching object. So some of this exploration was directed particularly at the stimuli that seemed to be the most important. Okay? So if we're looking, and this unfolds actually over time as well. So now looking at the high chair naming and the table namings on the two halves, in the first half with the white bars and the second half of the experiment. And what you can see is in the table condition, messy touches to the material match, so this is the total number. Most of those children in the table are not being super messy. Only maybe 3 messy touches most. Some of them get a little messier, and some of them get more messier as the experiment goes on. Okay? In the high chair, though, we see that Some of those children are not very messy early, but as it goes on, they're starting to get messier and messier, such that on some of those last trials, they're really getting their hands in those stimuli. Okay? And they're engaging more with the stimuli over time. So children in the high chair are increasing their messy touches over time. And what we see then, as that messy touching is increasing, we see their attention to material is also increasing. So now we're back to those typical graphs, proportion of shape choices for the high chair naming and the table naming conditions in the first half or the second half of the experiment. And what you can see is table naming is staying right around chance, but those children in the high chair, especially after getting messy with those stimuli, are generalizing by material. So children who were messy eaters at home were more likely to get messy in the lab when they were seated in that context that allows them to get messy, the high chair. Those children's generalizations of novel nouns for non-solid things follow the expected ontological distinction once they get in there and get messy with that stuff. This doesn't mean that children don't know the words jelly or pudding when they're not in the high chair. What it means is, in this task where you have to tell these things apart, you have to get messy with them to do that. And that context allows their behaviors, their way of knowing what to do with these stimuli to come out in a way that the table context does not. So what I've shown you is try to convince you that sometimes you need to get your hands messy to know something. Children do that in a very particular context, and seating them in that context in a laboratory helps to bring that knowledge to bear in the context of the lab such that they get messier with the stimuli, and then they show us what they know about how non-solids are named. So how are children so good at learning language? Well, I think the solution has to do with embodied communication. This learning is unfolding over time and in space, and over multiple time scales. The time scale of the experiment, the time scale of their learning history, the time scale of development. The child is structuring those learning situations, and their cognitive system structures those learning situations as well in terms of what they remember, what they attend to, what they touch, what they experience. This fact, the fact that we encode spatial locations in memory, means that space can bind names for objects. That was the first bit of what I showed you. It also means that messy exploration happens in a particular context, and that means that context can elicit behaviors necessary for a task. So more generally, behavior doesn't happen all in the head. It happens out there in space and time. The body and the space it occupies shape our abstract cognitive processes. The body and the space it occupies are constants. They're things that we're bringing with us over time. So they can bring the past to bear on the present and support mappings between novel words and reference and generalization of those novel mappings to new instances. And of course, my asterisk is that with children, these are changing systematically, and that's also a very interesting source of information as development unfolds. So, thank you.
This was really an amazing demonstration of how you can put order onto messy dependencies of everything on everything. So there's a question up here. There's one, two. Where's the other microphone? Should we take this? Yeah. So we start with Eric just because of the convenience, and then you get the microphone.
So I get to start?
I guess so.
Thanks. Thank you very much for a nice talk. You were showing one modeling piece, just shortly there, and I was just curious to ask, since this is what quite a few of us are doing, the modeling part, so to speak, what, from your perspective, what is the most important thing that the model brings, or do you think that it brings that much to your side of the investigation, so to speak?
I really do think the modeling brings a lot. So as Gregor mentioned in the beginning, I use both the dynamic neural field models in collaboration with people. I also use some connectionist models as well to look at word learning and look at different components of word learning. In this particular case, not as much for this audience, but in talking about that issue of children inferring somebody else's intent. And in my field, it really is this case where we put a lot of heavy cognitive processes in the baby's head to do that. The modeling, I think, has been helpful because you can see in that model the way it's actually working. That when you point in the model, it cues that location in space, and it makes it so there's something there that you can bind the referent to. And I think it's critical in that way in terms of being able to see the process in a way I can't do with the children, right? The modeling is also critical in terms of kind of understanding the larger constraints. So the model that I use there is tied to models that John Spencer and Gregor Schoner have used to look at a whole host of other processes. John and I have used it to look at children's naming of hierarchical categories. So the fact that children a little older than what I did here can learn that a dog can be called Rover at a subordinate level, can be called poodle, can be called dog, can be called animal, right? Which is a very complicated task for the child. The model actually can do that and can make predictions about what instances they're going to need to see to do that effectively. And it's actually the exact same model. So that's nice to be able to tie multiple tasks together. The particular version of the model that you saw today, I didn't show it to you, but it also does comprehension and production. It also does development of a shape bias. So that bias to attend to shape, we actually have evidence suggesting it's coming from having learned a lot of words that refer to solid objects and categories well organized by similarity and shape. And what my postdoc, Sammy Peroni, and I are doing now is actually using measures that we have of individual children's vocabularies, the specific words that they know, using that as input to structure those long-term memories of vocabulary the child has, and shows which children are going to develop that bias based on their history and which children are not. And maybe even what I would need to do to get child A to demonstrate a bias, because this is what they're missing in those statistics. So in that way it is. I mean, so that's just a few examples. But in my own thinking, I find it's very much necessary to kind of lay down the model to really think about what are the constraints, what am I assuming, what has to be there, what doesn't have to be there, what's critical, I mean, all the things that I think that we've heard about in various talks and that you guys worry about all the time. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, thank you for the talk. You were focusing on the initial stages of learning object names, as we've seen, and as I understood, the object location plays a role for child decision making, and I would expect that cross-situational learning would be the following stage for the child to realize that object location doesn't play a role in its naming, that is sort of irrelevant feature. How is this linked, or how is this consistent with knowledge about fast learning that is observed in children, which means that a single exposure might be sufficient for, or is not true? So can you please comment on that?
So I have a little spiel. So my other cognitive modeling work is looking at fast mapping. So the phenomenon in general, the lore is that you can present an object one time, name it a single time, and children will remember that referent. Now, in the context of the extensive naming I did, right, if I hold this object up and I say pointer, as I said, 13-month-olds will show delayed retention of that name. So I do that, I say pointer. For a 13-month-old, I can't wait very long, just a minute or two, and then I do a 2-item forced choice task, and I say get the pointer, they will get the right object, okay? 24-month-olds, the way we test it usually was in a disambiguation task. So usually we have 3 things. So maybe they know glass, they know pen, I'm going to call this pen, okay, but they don't know pointer. And what we'll say is get the pointer in that reference selection task, very good. Okay, this is Carrie's chromium tray, which was done in daycare. Bring me the chromium tray, not the blue tray, the chromium tray, and they get the green tray. In this context, they'll pick up this object, okay? We do that with several objects over the course of an experiment. We go into the waiting room, we color for 5 minutes, okay? And now I test you where you learned this one and this one and some other object, we'll say, right? So you just learned pointer and zup and blicket, okay? 5 minutes later I say, get the pointer, they can't do it, okay? Now, they can do it in a supported task. If you reduce the number of objects, if you name it multiple times, if you've got explicit contracts and syntax, and if they're 3, they can do it pretty well. 24-month-olds, they don't do it after a 5-minute delay. Interestingly, if you give them a minute of exposure with these objects before you do the fast mapping task, so I just let them explore it, no naming, no nothing, free play, and then I do the fast mapping task, then they'll retain it. If you think about it, it's a darn hard task, right? I mean, that's why it's lore. That's why everybody thinks it's so critical. You could rule out some models based on that, right? That you're getting one exposure or very few exposures to an object, and you make that association, right? But you have to encode something about the referent, you have to encode something about that word form, and you have to map those two things together. Turns out that's just a little bit too much to do. If you have some half of that equation ahead of time, then you can do it. That's what the familiarization kind of shows, right? There's another way to think about that, too, in that you really might not want that to be the way it would work, okay? Because if you're going down that, and for some reason I said pointer, and you picked the wrong object, you've got that mapped, now you have to work to undo that, okay? And that's not actually going to be the most efficient system for naming. What you might want to do is move a little bit in that direction, but not completely, okay? And the other part of it is, in these embedded, engaged interactions that are unfolding over time, it might not be that you have to do any more in that moment than find the referent that's being referred to in a more constrained setting. So I can find this thing, but I might not have to lay down the full memory, because except in my experiments, where else is Mom going to say 5 minutes later, get the pointer, right, in that kind of hard task? So the way it kind of fits in, and the model that we use to capture some of that is a basic association model, works with Hebbian learning. And basically what it shows is a couple time scales that they're very good at using information presented in the task to constrain what the possible referent is in the moment. And over lots of exposures, they'll reinforce that mapping and get it down, but it takes some time for that to unfold. And we can capture a number of different bunches of data. That's work with Bob McMurray. It's in Psych Review.
Yeah, thank you very much for this very interesting talk. Now, would you say that the high chair acts more as an affordance or more as priming, and then if it can be overridden? So, for instance, by either sitting the child down in the high chair and, for instance, feeding the child, let's say either apple puree or a boiled carrot, and then one would be, you know, like substance, one would be more like concrete shape, or by word naming, where you would, for instance, name an edible item that is either, again, mousse-like or shape-like, and whether that could override, you know, the effect of the high chair itself. So would it be more of a, like an affordance, or would it be more like priming?
Okay, and I missed a little bit of the beginning of the question because I was trying to find you. So the question is kind of what's the relative importance of the high chair, right? To some extent, I think the high chair is kind of a nice demonstration of context effects, right? So we know context effects work for all of us in terms of learning, right? And remembering things, and I think that's exactly what it is. The children are used to having certain kinds of experiences in context, and that's what it brings out, right? I do agree, though, that none of it is single shot, right? I think the other kind of answer, which I didn't really talk about here, in terms of how are children so good at learning words, is that it's not just one thing that they have at their disposal to do this, right? There are lots of things impinging on the system to help them get to the point of that correct referent, right? It may be specific context and consistency in what they experience in one context or another. It might be consistency in terms of the way the language names things. It's going to be consistency in the fact that they've got a mature social partner who often structures the context for them, right? And so I would say that all these things are working together. Which one is most relevant at a particular point in time is going to depend on the way I set up the experiment, right? And, you know, it can go so far that I can do things that make it look like children know things that maybe they only know so well, not so well. And I can also make it look like they don't know something that they do, right? I mean, some studies suggest children can distinguish the solids and non-solids at 5 months, right, based on visual cues. Later in this more challenging task, they don't seem to be able to do that as well, right? It's because there are multiple things coming together in the system at once, and they're all going to kind of be pushing. So it's that balance of things. Does that kind of get to what you're asking?
Well, we can talk in the
Okay.
coffee break or lunch.
Yeah. So thanks for the very interesting talk. My question is about the first part, so the MODI experiment. So in the experiment that you showed, the location of the objects can always be represented with an egocentric representation by the kid.
Yeah.
So I was wondering, so that can be also basically a motor representation, which is linked to the action the baby do to gaze at the object. And so I was wondering if it's more not a word to location association that the kid learns, but more words to body configuration that is learning. And with that respect, I was wondering if you ever did, or you think it would be interesting to put the babies on the other side of the table before asking where is the mood.
Yeah. I think these are excellent. I mean, I think it's one of the reasons why it's nice to be able to move to that level of seeing how this space matters, because now we might be able to look at the cognitive processes in more fine-grained detail. So we haven't done it yet, right? One issue would be the egocentric versus other kinds of cues. I think, and I don't really do long-term retention tests with those young children, so I don't know for sure, right? So the one question would be, after they get MODI to that object, how long does that hang around, right? And can they generalize it to those other contexts? I never did the generalization test with those children, okay? And we are doing, in my lab now, it's not exactly what you're looking for, but we are now looking, instead of a single object, looking at categories of objects. And so we have categories defined by 4 exemplars and then a central prototype. And so over the familiarization trials, we show them the exemplars of each of the categories, and then they're tested with the prototype to see if they can kind of get to that more abstract level instead of just the single one. Doesn't deal with the issue of whether it's a motor, how it's encoded in terms of motor response or other things. You know, the fact that the behavior they have to make at the end, so when they're actually doing the task, and again, we have to think about the fact they're small, and so it is really more turning and leaning and reaching and more than I could, you know, it's not like this, like I can do, right? And then when they do the response, now that's back at central. So at least they're going from this kind of orientation and that kind of stuff to a slightly different one. I don't know, for instance, if I did something where I had them, you know, in some of the classic work that Linda Smith and Esther Thielen did with the A not B task, where if I did something where they do the whole task sitting and then I stand them up, in other studies that matters, right, and that changes the nature of the behavior, and I don't know in this case. It would be interesting to do, right? The other thing that I think is interesting that we are looking into doing is, this is also very simple in terms of just a right hand, left hand, 2 sides of the table with midline, right? And we know that not too far after this period, by 36 months of age, children are able to make finer discriminations in terms of that space. And so it would be interesting to know, some of the other work that John and Gregor have done together has looked at how children, the biases they have in remembering spatial locations and how those biases drift over time. They have a specific hypothesis about how children's encoding of space changes over time in terms of precision of those neural interactions. So it would be very interesting to know, does that also help predict what kind of spaces they could divide up in my task, right? Could they use 3 locations? Okay. I have evidence that the 24-month-olds can't use 3 locations in this task. It's still too hard, but 3-year-olds might be able to do it, right? And that isn't exactly taking them to the other side of the table, but that starts to look at how their encoding of space factors into this question of how well they can map things, right? And I don't know if we spun them all the way around to the other side, right? This young age, when they're actually coding it egocentrically, I would bet that they're going to mess up. By 24 months of age, where they start to be able to use other kinds of cues, they should be able to do better. But we haven't done it. So.
Thank you.
Okay. I have a really simple question. Why children?
Why children?
You, obviously, children, particularly younger ones, introduce a host of difficulties in your experimental setup, and a lot of the tasks that you're doing could be done with second language acquisition. They could be done with pseudo words. In fact, you used pseudo words in some of the examples, and that would be actually quite interesting because, of course, the patterns you're after aren't really the patterns for particular Homo sapiens early language acquisition, but some more general insights. So is that something you're thinking, or is that just something that other people do and therefore you don't? Or
Well, it is true that there are a number of folks who worry about some of the cross-linguistic distinctions. So, for instance, in the shape versus material generalization case, as I mentioned, English makes a particular distinction. Japanese, for instance, doesn't make that same distinction. Spanish has a slightly different break in terms of the continuum from individual entities to non-individuatable entities. And other people have done very interesting work showing that those statistics and the way your language encodes those things do matter, right? I've focused on the monolingual English children just because I'm trying to focus in on a particular part and show the whole story for that particular case. It is the case that children introduce some difficulties in what I do. I wasn't initially trained as a developmental psychologist. That came a little bit later. I focus on children because I like the fact I can see the change happening quickly, and I can do perturbations that matter, right, in changing some of these things. But you're right, a lot of these things are very general. So the space encoding stuff, Michael Spivey and a number of Richardson, they've got a number of different studies that show adults showing the exact same spatial encoding for learning new facts, right? And so you learn a bunch of facts associated with people's faces showing up in the Hollywood Squares kind of grid, and then when you have to recall those facts, you look back to location even though there's nothing there anymore, right? So I do believe these are general processes, and what I'm trying to do is take some of what we know about the general cognitive system and show how it's working very early sometimes too.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. Can I go back to the sort of previous question about how much do we think it is a motoric response?
No.
And specifically, not so much putting them around the other side of the table, but should we be looking at the problem in a slightly different way rather than linguistically driven, perhaps a motor-driven sort of conceptual framework that could be modeled?
So if you're talking about the problem writ large of terms of word learning, yeah, I think it is worth, I mean, the history is to think that, you know, this is high-level language, right? I think this is one of a number of studies that suggest that these lower-level things are playing a role, right? The short arms kind of idea also suggests, right, that the limits of the child's body are structuring that situation in very interesting ways, right? So I would suggest that, yeah, some of those other kind of responses, when you can see them, right? I mean, that's the problem, is that requires thinking about the task presented to the child and being willing to think that that task is going to matter in what they're doing for this kind of high-level abstract kind of case, right? Which I think sometimes the field has not been as interested in doing, right? That we want to separate these things. But yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely an important way to go, right?
I was going to close. Short question.
So you have shown a model to, based on neural dynamical fields, to show how the vocabulary. So I create a new word.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, do you think that a similar mechanism could also explain how an object is identified as a new object, or the word in some sense creates the new object?
The word or the word?
I mean, when I have a new name, I mean, the question is, maybe you have a similar, you may have a similar mechanisms to justify that this is a new object. It was not my duck. It's not anymore. Or when I give a new name, this is a new object class. I don't know if the question should be a bit strange. Because you have this nice model which you use for awards. Maybe at a lower layer I could have a similar model which justifies a new object. Or maybe when I have a name for something which is a new kind of something.
And this is a classic question. Is it the case that labels can drive finding differences between potentially similar things to tell them apart, right? And we haven't explored that yet in the model, but that would certainly be possible, right? So trying to understand if I'm providing a label, because labels are acting as a binding agent to try to really glue that shape and that material together, if I give you a new label, does it help you to then put new shape and new color together? Or maybe this shape with a slightly different material, and now I'm giving a different label, so now that becomes a distinctly different thing, right? Because it's bound in this other way, right? It's interesting. I haven't explored that, and it'd be interesting to think about in the context of the model currently tuned, right? So that it does all these other things that it does. In what cases does it motivate creating new categories, really is what your lexical categories, right? And do children show the same patterns? Yeah, that'd be very interesting to look at. Yeah. Think about that. Thank you.
Maybe I can close the discussion, which was maybe a comment that we could perhaps take up in the panel.
Okay.
I thought very interesting in your presentation and Susan's this morning also the struggle, the scientific struggle to deal with embodiment. That a lot of things matter, details matter, and it's much less about big invariants, modules that you can nicely separate. I think in the history of science and the history of this discipline, this has been a continuous struggle. I know you've been struggling sometimes with reviewers about things like that, and in that sense I would say the cards are stacked a little bit against integrative synthesis kind of oriented views as embodiment are, and that's maybe partly something that in this community has been a topic from many different sides, and maybe we should think a little bit about how to communicate about that. But maybe let me first thank you again.